Welcome to Module 8 of the Mercado Institute of International Trade training program entitled Air Transportation. Clearly, we're moving in a different direction now, given that the previous two modules dealt with ocean freight. Needless to say, air transportation is equally important in a global supply chain, and we're going to give it the proper treatment. Although the mode of transportation is different, our objectives for Module 8 are similar to those that we saw in ocean freight. First, we want to present air transportation as a vital component of a U.S. import supply chain, either as a primary mode of transportation or in support of ocean freight. We also wish to offer a multifaceted portrayal of all the players and activities involved in a U.S. air import program. Third bullet, another of our objectives is to enhance the students' understanding of the operational, service, and documentation components of importing into the U.S. via air transportation. And we will treat each one in detail, the operational side, the service side, and the documentation side. And then finally, we want to share tactical and operational expertise that enhances an importer's knowledge of all aspects of inbound air transportation. In other words, putting the student in a position to utilize the information provided here out in the workplace. The agenda is fairly long. We do have about 140 slides in this overall module. First off, we'll talk about the evolution of the U.S. air import market, starting from basically the 1970s to the present. We'll go through the structure and players in the U.S. air import market. Third, we're going to introduce IATA, which is the International Air Transport Association, and the role it plays in U.S. imports. And then in the next two sections, we'll talk about different types of aircraft, passenger and all cargo aircraft, as well as unit loading devices, pallets, LD3s, etc., etc. Next up will be the role of the freight forwarder in U.S. air imports. Then we'll get into the air import service model itself and analyze freight consolidation versus direct shipments. From there, we'll go into air import documentation, talking about airway bills. Much like we did in the ocean freight module, we'll calculate the difference between actual versus volume, or what is referred to as chargeable weight for air freight. And then we'll wrap things up with some best practices for working with air import freight forwarders. Let us jump right in. We do have a brief history lesson here, the evolution of the air cargo industry, which provides a backdrop and additional perspective when we build upon the operational, service, and documentation component of importing into the U.S. via air freight. This is a fairly brief treatment of the history, but interesting nonetheless. First bullet. Up until the 1970s, air transport in the United States, both passenger and cargo, was regulated by a federal agency that was called the CAB, the Civil Aeronautics Board. As we see in our first sub-bullet, airfares and air cargo charges were predetermined and fixed. Essentially, all modes of transportation in the United States was regulated, truck, rail, etc. Second bullet, but starting with President Gerald Ford in 1974, steps were taken to deregulate all forms of transportation in the U.S., primarily truck, rail, and air freight. Let's just say right now that without deregulation of the air passenger and cargo industry, there would be no air freight forwarding community, and costs would have continued to skyrocket. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter signed into law the Airline Deregulation Act, the ADA, thus ending the regulation of pricing for passengers and cargo. As we said, that was really the beginning of the air freight forwarding industry and the relationship that importers, exporters, freight forwarders, and airlines have been able to have over the course of 40 or 50 years. Since then, the U.S. air cargo industry has evolved into four segments, which we'll talk about in some detail, each of these. Let's begin by saying we have all cargo airlines. These are carriers that just do cargo. We have passenger airlines, passenger aircraft, much like the one we see in our image on the right, where the primary business of the carrier is moving people, but they also have room for cargo. Integrators are a little bit different. We will go into more detail, but let's just say for now that the integrators of the world are the UPSs, DHLs, FedExes, etc. And then finally on this slide, we have aircraft leasing and charter companies that are a little bit behind the scenes, but play a vital role in doing just that, leasing aircraft to both carriers and forwarders, as well as charter services, the ability to rent an entire aircraft for a specific flight. Probably most relevant for our conversation, the ADA also paved the way for air freight forwarders to negotiate rates with air carriers and offer cargo consolidation services. We will study more than just air freight consolidation services, but let's make clear now that a great deal of what we will talk about in this module is all about consolidation services. As we see in our sub-bullet, the ADA opened the door for both domestic air freight forwarding and international air freight forwarding, where the forwarder is the middle person between the shipping community, importers and exporters, and actual asset operating airlines. Last bullet here, in addition to the actual carriers, there are a number of players that support the U.S. air import market. We're going to end section 1 here. When we come back, as you probably guessed, we're going to go through who all those players are, define their role, and what value they bring to the overall air import supply chain.